Thank you. Now that I have your attention, our next panel will look at why it's become even more crucial than ever that we investigate the Supreme Court and its justices as the powerful entities that they are. We'll feature the work of two reporters who have been at the forefront of this work. Julia Longoria will moderate. Julia is the host of More Perfect, a show from WNYC Studios about the Supreme Court. She got her start at WLRN, the local NPR station in her hometown of Miami. Her previous work has also appeared in the New York Times, Radiolab, and Planet Money. Most recently, she co-created and hosted The Atlantic's flagship weekly radio show, The Experiment. Over to you, Julia.
Thank you. I am so thrilled to be here with you all. I am starstruck by my panel. Let me take a minute first to introduce them. Jo Becker is a reporter in the investigative unit at the New York Times and a 3-time Pulitzer Prize winner. Her investigative targets have run the gamut from former Vice President Dick Cheney's real influence in the Bush White House to Vladimir Putin's kleptocracy, to former President Donald Trump's ties to Russia. She has written about national security and President Barack Obama's secret kill list, dug into the global machine behind the rise of the far right, and documented the missteps that led to America's failed intervention in Libya. But the Supreme Court has long been a topic of fascination to her. She has done long-form investigative profiles of 3 of the sitting justices, and her book, Forcing the Spring: Inside the Fight for Marriage Equality, chronicled the epic legal battle to bring that issue before the nation's high court and was named one of the best of 2014 by the New York Times and the Washington Post. Whew. So, Justin Elliott has been a reporter with ProPublica since 2012, where he covers business and politics. He currently covers the Supreme Court. In recent years, he was on the team of reporters documenting how the rich avoid taxes for the Secret IRS Files series. He co-wrote the story revealing tech mogul Peter Thiel's multi-billion-dollar Roth IRA. Previously, his work on TurboTax maker Intuit's misleading marketing tactics led to a settlement that delivered $141 million back to consumers, a wild story that affected me. He has won numerous awards, including a Gerald Loeb Award for Business Journalism, the Selden Ring Award, and an Investigative Reporters and Editors Award for a series on the American Red Cross. So we are gathered here today to discuss the highest court in our land. And I want to just really get into the nuts and bolts of the stories that these 2 impressive journalists have broken, how they broke the stories that they broke. But first I wanted to talk about what brought the 3 of us to the beat of the Supreme Court. I think the Supreme Court has a bit of a special place in the American imagination. I personally first became obsessed with the Supreme Court in high school. Like a lot of us, I was very cool in high school, I'm sure. I was on my high school's Constitution team. And I recently caught up with my high school government teacher, the coach, and she talked to me about her romantic vision of the Supreme Court that I think a lot of us had in high school of, the court as the voice of the voiceless who swoops in, when democracy fails us and stands up for the little guy, which, if you go to the historical record, that is not always true, and maybe not even mostly true, or only a few times is that true. Yeah, I wanted to start with Jo, who's been fascinated with the court for a long time, has done quite a few investigations. Jo, how did you get interested in the court? When did you start covering it?
So I was a reporter in Florida, and I had done quite a lot of work on the Florida State Supreme Court, which I was also fascinated with. So I'm clearly a frustrated constitutional lawyer with no degree. And then I left Florida at the St. Pete Times to go to the Washington Post in August of 2000, which turned out to be quite the lucky break for me because in November of 2000, of course, we had the deadlocked presidential election between Bush and Gore. So I got on a plane and went back to Florida and spent the next couple months following every ripple in the Bush v. Gore case, and after that, with my colleagues at the Washington Post, wrote a book called Deadlock, where we sort of went behind the scenes to really understand what was going on in that. And at that point, I was hooked. At the Washington Post, I was fortunate to get assigned to do investigative profiles of John Roberts and Sam Alito, and the short-lived nomination of Harriet Miers. I'm sure most of you probably don't even know who she is. And I just, I loved the topic. I loved the subjects. And in truth, I'm kind of a geek too, although I was Model UN. I love the law, and I do have this vision of the court as something that should be a model, which I don't think means we should not cover it or, in our reverence for what it should be, not hold it to account, because I think in doing that we can make it better.
Yeah, how about you, Justin?
Well, yeah. First of all, let me just say I was a math lead in high school, so I didn't get into the legal stuff until later. But yeah, well, it sort of first came on my radar maybe a year ago, before I actually was reporting on it, because our editor-in-chief of ProPublica, Steve Engelberg, actually sent around one of Joe's stories, the profile of Ginny Thomas, the wife of Clarence Thomas, that was in the New York Times Magazine, and was sort of like, this is what we want. And we were like, oh God, we're not gonna be able to do anything like this. But back in, I think, December, my reporting partner, Josh Kaplan, and I were sort of casting around for stories, and I think the dam kind of broke last year with like the Politico's work on the leak of the Dobbs opinion, all of the Times work on the court, and so we sort of just started reading, and we got interested in the travel issue, and I can talk a lot more about how we got into it, but that's kind of, yeah.
Yeah, and I should say just at the top here, the stories that we're here to talk about, Joe has broken quite a few stories about the Supreme Court. One of the most fascinating ones, at least for me reading it, it's a fascinating account. It's like 14,000 words about Justice Clarence Thomas and Ginny Thomas. And she was the first to kind of identify that Ginny Thomas might have had involvement in trying to overturn the 2020 election. And she also spoke to an anti-abortion leader, Reverend Rob Schenck, who campaigned to embolden the justices to take a more unapologetic view on abortion, and sort of revealing the undue influence that justices might be having from civilians. She also revealed that, over the last 20 years, the Supreme Court Historical Society has been a sort of secret hiding in plain view. About 60% of their funds over the last 20 years come from corporations, special interests, law firms that argue before the court. And of course, Justin broke the story of Clarence Thomas's relationship with Republican megadonor, Harlan Crow, which has been the talk of the town, at least at More Perfect. I want to get into the nuts and bolts of these two stories. And we'll start with, actually, I want to ask Justin, you came to the court later, or pretty recently as a journalist, before you were uncovering finances of different, just other beats. And I wonder, why did ProPublica choose to tackle this kind of story now?
Yeah, it's a good question. So after, around sort of January 6th, in the wake of that, my bosses decided to create, and I think secured funding for what we called the democracy team, because we were, obviously, I think January 6th was sort of a wake-up call on that. I had been, for the last couple of years, as you mentioned, writing about tax avoidance and evasion by very rich people, and so I was assigned to this democracy team, and within that we were sort of just allowed to develop our own ideas, and Josh Kaplan and I decided that originally, actually, we were thinking we were going to write more broadly about the judiciary, I think the judiciary more broadly, including the courts below the Supreme Court, merit a lot more coverage. So that's how we got into it.
And what do you think is, having the sort of comparison point, what is the challenge of covering the Supreme Court as an investigative journalist, doing the kind of work you do?
Yeah, so, over the years, I've done a fair amount of stories about Congress and sort of influence lobbying, covering the executive branch, and kind of bread and butter of that work are records like calendars of public officials, lobbying disclosures, which you get with Congress, campaign finance disclosures, visitor logs, that sort of thing. And I think when we sort of started to get our feet wet trying to understand the kind of records terrain with the court, what you realize pretty quickly is that there really isn't one. So the judiciary, including the Supreme Court, is not covered by FOIA. One thing that sort of is still striking to me is the justice, unlike the president or, cabinet secretaries, there's no public calendars for the justices. The Supreme Court puts out a calendar of like when they're in session and when they're meeting, which is not actually that often. And so if you want to know where Justice Thomas was or Justice Sotomayor on a particular day, there's really no way to do it unless they happen to give a speech that was like covered by some local news outlet. So the reporting that we sort of ended up embarking on in many ways was just kind of trying to create a calendar for Justice Thomas. I think the main challenge is like it turns out all these sort of transparency measures that we have, as flawed as they are sometimes for other parts of the federal government, don't exist for the Supreme Court, and those turn out to really matter, I think.
Totally, yeah. It's like unlike the other political branches, you have sort of a place to start, FOIA, public disclosure. And so it's been fascinating to read the stories that both of you have written, and just kind of wonder, I want to start like really at the very beginning, Joe, with the story you did about Ginny Thomas and Clarence Thomas's relationship. It's sort of the sweeping account over many, many years. Where did you start with that story? What question did you have, and how did you begin to like even start to report it?
Yeah, so I'm a fan of what I call stories hiding in plain sight. I spent 2 years on a series of stories about Dick Cheney, who was very much at that time in the news all the time. He was the vice president, and there was all sorts of questions about undue influence by him on the Bush administration. But I think sometimes, even though we think things are picked over and there's been so many stories, what could we possibly add? I know from the conference in our own newsroom over Justin's story that there's probably lots more stories still that we all haven't gotten to as far as the Supreme Court. But on this story, we started with a pretty basic question, which was that we wanted to understand better the relationship that Clarence Thomas and Ginny Thomas had with one another, and how, if at all, their work overlapped. They have always said, "Hey, she's a working woman in her own right. Our lanes don't cross." And so the animating question was, is that true? And if not, could we do more than tell? Could we show exactly how these lanes crossed? And as you referenced, and you referenced earlier, you quickly learn that it's incredibly difficult to get people to talk to you. There's no records, but it's also really difficult to get people to talk. And partly, I sort of compare it to national security reporting, where, but for a different reason. There you have people who are going to go to jail if they give you classified information. But here, it's much more about the culture of the court. So the justices themselves feel that it harms the court to talk about one another. So there's really no open debate between them. We don't know how various players feel about the ethics, debate that's currently going on, because they just simply don't say. We do have a sense that they've basically all signed on to something that says we don't need any more. But was there a debate before that? Who knows? And there's this kind of culture of, I would say, like, omerta, almost, even among the clerks, long gone. They've gone on to great careers. They do also, to talk about what a justice thought, said, did, is just simply not done. So you start with a lot of hurdles. And in our case, I think we were lucky, so you've got to find workarounds to that. And in our case, we were lucky on a couple of fronts. I mean, obviously, we wanted to understand to what extent their careers overlapped. So, you kind of go into the open, open source world, right? And you see that, okay, for instance, Ginny Thomas got an award. She on Twitter, they put it out from a place called the Eagle Forum, which, for those of you not aware, was run for a long time by Phyllis Schlafly. It was a vehemently anti-abortion group. And you go, So the wife of a Supreme Court justice who is overseeing, who sits on abortion cases is getting an award from a very anti-abortion group. What's that about? And then you sort of dig deeper and you realize, well, wait a second, hang on. Clarence Thomas also got an award from this group. And then you kind of, go deeper. And in my case, it was really great because I like, again, you want to know, just simply getting an award, like, what were they saying about him? Why did they give him this award? I mean, it's all closed to the press. There's no anything. So I started looking around, and in that case, there was a Eagle Forum. I started looking at I found this library of material, which they keep, and it turns out, like, they keep all this material in the tiny chapter located in Alabama. So I picked up the phone and I call this lady, and whoever answers sounds like about an 80-year-old librarian. And I said, I'm super interested in, she didn't, I didn't misrepresent myself, but she didn't ask and I didn't tell. So I said, I'm super, I'm super interested in, your, Clarence Thomas and blah, blah, blah. And I see that you've got this thing and I would love to come and listen to it. And she said, oh, honey, you don't have to come down here and listen to it. I'll just put that in the mail for you. I said, okay, what do I need? So I give her my address, and she sends this tape, and I'm like thinking, this is like, oh, thank God, finally I get to hear something in his own voice, which was, off limits. So it arrives, and it's a cassette tape, and that then sets off this, like, nobody I know has a cassette tape player, so we're trying to figure out how to get this thing. So we finally get it, like, digitalized and whatever, and it's hilarious because it's like Phyllis Schlafly, like, talking about what a champion he's been on abortion and blah 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 blah, and literally reading, like, the worst poem. She wrote a poem about him, which is just the worst poem ever. But it was like this, like, you really got this moment of, like, reality there. And then, you dig some more and you realize, well, wait a second, when Ginny got this award from this group, they raise money every year with these awards. They invite people to come and they pay for tables, and this is like their main fundraiser. And she is out there saying, please come listen to a conversation with my husband, Clarence. And we'll buy a table, essentially, which is against the Judicial Ethics Code, which says that justices shouldn't be headliners for fundraising events. Of course, you come to realize that the Judicial Ethics Code doesn't actually cover the Supreme Court, though they say they consult it. And I think, like, we can all agree from all of our reporting, when they say that they consult it, it's a very loose definition of consult. So that sort of was a great break in that story. Another really good break in that story was we were able to, we knew that Ginny was a member of the Council for National Policy, which is a very secretive group, which became kind of like the hub of the especially during Trump, of the kind of Trump message. Essentially, she was on the action board. So it was like they would have these panels, and then they would say, okay, what are the actions that you can do, and go out and do these things. And they would put that out to their members. So we were able to get the behind-the-scenes video from that was buried in underneath their website. It wasn't that we hacked it or did anything bad, or anybody else hacked it or did anything bad, but they just had very loose security, and so you couldn't find it from the public-facing part of the website, but if you sort of could do these like kind of searches for things of interest to you, and that's what we did with the help of a researcher, of an OSINT researcher. And we found like some incredible stuff in there. Like one, we found this like, again, like, you know, they always sort of try to portray themselves as happy warriors, and but it became very clear that both of them, for different or sometimes similar reasons, harbored some pretty deep resentments. And one of the tapes really kind of spoke to that. And it was a tape where Ginny Thomas was asked during Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearings, which, as many of you know, featured, you know, allegations by women that he sexually assaulted them when he was a young man, which he denied. But Ginny was asked to come and talk because, of course, her husband had his confirmation hearing had featured sexual harassment charges by a woman named Anita Hill. And when she's speaking to this group, she's talking about, you know, I'm feeling the pain. Clarence is feeling the pain of going through false charges against a good man. And then she just kind of becomes somewhat unhinged and starts talking about like all these signs that there are these existential threats to like their way of life, this group's way of life. And like the things that she picks were like, you see rainbow flags at businesses. And, you know, I have to go into my vet's office and see signs that say, spread kindness, build community, hate is not welcome here. Like, this is really bad stuff, you know? And it was so telling of like what, you know, it was like this wonderful thing to show like just where this resentment is really coming from. And then we also, you know, I think another break came from just being able to talk to a lot of people in the Trump White House who, you know, you might think wouldn't necessarily be willing to talk to us, but she so pissed people off there that there was a lot of resentment because it turns out Trump was pretty fascinated by Clarence Thomas during the campaign, and he went to Leonard Leo, who has, if many of you don't know, but Leonard Leo is credited with basically drawing up all the lists for Trump's judicial nominees. And Trump turned to Leonard Leo and said, you know, what, this guy gets more applause on the campaign trail than me. So Leonard tells me this, right? And which was sort of foundational because he then invites Thomas into the White House, and Thomas shows up like with his wife. Okay, so she's running a political consulting business at this point, and her husband, who operates in quote unquote separate lanes, is bringing her in with him. And then she uses his courtship of Clarence Thomas to her own ends. And she starts bringing in her, you know, her political consulting friends and bringing in all these people to the Trump White House, including she brings in a bunch of people who are extremely angry at what in this White House meeting is called the transgender agenda. And they go into this unhinged diatribe about trans people, and it was so memorable and so ugly that like people talked about it. And you know, she was also like constantly telling people to fire and hire people. So of course this then leads us to the ultimate question, which is, well, if she's doing this, what did she do when it came to the actual disputed election? Because by this time she's, you know, Trump cheerleader number one. And we were able, through these Council of National Policy documents, to find that she was sending out action memos for people to send their state legislators in the disputed states, basically the talking points that you don't have to certify this election. And so that was like one piece, and then we were able to also talk to organizers who I had first talked to actually for a January 6th story that we did, sort of recreating the days of January 6th, who said, yes, Ginny was involved, and she was like partly sort of involved in organizing the January 6th rally. So, sorry, I'm very long-winded.
And just to just ask a follow-up, like finding these political connections, the influence Ginny Thomas had with President Trump, it seems, the way she participated in January 6th. Is that unusual for a spouse of a Supreme Court justice?
Well, so that's the other thing, sorry.
Yeah.
I mean, context counts, right? So no spouse of a Supreme Court justice has ever been as openly politically active as Ginny Thomas. I mean, that's just a statement of fact. And the reason is that most, for the most part, spouses have kind of kept a low profile, and so that there wouldn't be any kind of conflict. Here, what you had was Ginny being active on the very topics that the court was or would be considering, whether it be, like, for instance, during the time when she arranges this White House, when she goes into the White House to talk about, what she considers the, quote, transgender agenda, there's a case on, there's a case literally on its way to the Supreme Court for them to decide on. Same is true with the election. Like, she's advocating for all of this stuff, and he's ruling on cases that are, related to this dispute. So, it's hugely problematic. I mean, again, like what you kind of come up against again and again when you talk about Supreme Court reporting is that you think that there are rules, but they're really just norms. And there's a recusal statute that says they should recuse in certain instances. And the one that's sort of most pertinent is, the case that's most pertinent is Clarence Thomas during all of this ruled on a case that, where the issue was, should documents have to be turned over from the National Archives about January 6th, and communications that were the communications that were going on within the White House, it would turn out after our story ran, would show that Ginny was in constant communication with the White House Chief of Staff, advocating all sorts of things, and he said that they shouldn't have to be turned over, and this has all been raised, and basically they just kind of go, eh.
So I want to turn to you, Justin, and I have to say, like, the story is just full of these, like, delicious details, these morsels, like the cassette tape. I was like, I gotta listen to that cassette tape. I wonder if she has it digitized. But Justin, going to you, I want to sort of tell the story of your reporting, and my impression is that if we were doing the movie version of your reporting, it might begin with the death of Justice Antonin Scalia. In some ways, can you tell me what that revealed to you all, and who was?
Yeah, so as some people, as many people probably remember, Justice Scalia sort of famously died on this unusual, like, back in 2016 on this hunting trip at a private lodge in Texas, and I'm trying to remember, it was like owned by a member of like a secret society, a European secret society. By the way, I'm not sure we've ever really fully gotten to the bottom of what was going on with that. But when my reporting partner Josh Kaplan and I were sort of in the stage of trying to figure out what we were going to focus on, we were the Scalia death and that trip, and it was written about after the death. Was on our radar and got us interested in this question of, like, Supreme Court justices' travel. As we were just talking about, there's no records at the court. But one thing that people have realized, and this was not new with us, was that there's sort of one records avenue, which is the justices sometimes, not always, get security when they travel. There's kind of analog to the Secret Service for the president is the U.S. Marshals, which is actually part of the Justice Department. It's not part of the judiciary. So you can FOIA the U.S. Marshals. And I think we actually have a slide of this, of a document. But so we started reading some documents that we didn't get via FOIA, but that look like this. And these are U.S. Marshals kind of like write-ups of their of Supreme Court justices traveling. Now, and this is like a very typical one. And so there was a nonprofit that had gotten a bunch of these like a number of years ago that we're just looking at. And as you can see from this, like, they don't actually identify, there's like every like FOIA exemption that exists, I feel like is on here, like B1 through 12 or whatever. So what they tell you essentially is that a Supreme Court justice made a trip. They don't tell you which justice, but it does tell you a date and a location, and sometimes, importantly, like a method of travel. So sometimes it'll say like DC to New York, like Amtrak. And then, because a kind of subplot of the Scalia death trip was that he had taken a private jet on one leg of it. And so we decided to sort of, we started noticing some of these U.S. Marshals records talked about private plane travel, and sort of raises the obvious question, like, what's going on with this? The justices don't have like they actually sometimes fly commercial, it turns out, fairly often actually. And so this kind of first big break, and by the way, we didn't set out to write about Justice Thomas, but the break in the early break that sort of led us to these stories was we had sort of assembled a list of all these trips that involved private planes. They were trying to figure out how can we figure out anything about these, and another colleague who's been working on these stories, Alex Majerjeski, who's on our research team, on this trip, which was a 2016 flight from Washington, D.C. to New Haven, has a really small airport called Tweed. Turns out there's this like community of like plane spotters that will post stuff online of like pictures of planes, basically. And there's a very active community of plane spotters at Tweed, and the lucky break was that they had posted a video actually of a plane on this day from Tweed, and they said, Tweed was honored to get a visit from Justice Thomas on this day. And so that's sort of why we originally started to look at Justice Thomas, and then we quickly realized that it was Harlan Crow's plane, and actually like over the past 25 years, there have actually periodically been quite good stories about Harlan Crow and Justice Thomas. The last round of this was around 12 or 13 years ago by Ken Vogel, then at Politico, and also Mike McIntyre at the Times did a very good story about their relationship. And so we knew this was out there, but no one had really done anything on it since 2011. And so at a certain point, we just sort of decided that we should dive into this. So, like Joe was saying, I think with the Supreme Court, you have to kind of go from the outside. I mean, hopefully at some point we'll all have great sources on the inside, or you probably already do. But and a couple other key elements were the FAA the FAA's FOIA office is like probably the only federal agency that has a FOIA office that actually like works. You can get stuff in like 3 weeks from them. But all that tells you is like where a plane's going on dates and places. And the other sort of lucky break in terms of the reporting was the realization that when you're like traveling at the level of luxury that Crow and Thomas are traveling, it's like private jets, these yachts, there's a lot of workers involved. So there's like service workers who are not part of the Omerta code. And so at a certain point, we just sort of decided to dig into that world and
Didn't you call this the White Lotus effect? Or?
Yeah, like the White Lotus principle, you could call it.
Right,
there's a lot of, if your yacht has like 20 staff and they turn over every year or two, it's a lot of people.
How did you figure out the yachts?
Interestingly, there's actually like an equivalent. You can get some like yacht location data there's like a company that tracks that, but also there's just a lot of yacht workers that you can find on various like most of them are not American. There seems to be a lot of British and Kiwi and Australian people in that world for whatever reason. So it's not like on LinkedIn, but there's like yacht worker job boards and stuff where people post their resumes, and then just like normal reporting, once you get a few people, it gets much easier. Yes, yeah.
This is an open question, but Biden just signed a bill to protect the justices' security. Would you be able, given what they've done, to quote protect the justices' security, which makes what little data that we've been able to get less available? Would you be able to do this story under this new law?
I think so, yeah. And I mean, that sort of like if you look up any of the Supreme Court justices on like Nexus or some equivalent. They're not there. I believe because of this law or maybe some previous iteration of it. But yeah, I mean, I think the way data
This would
is
still be available?
well, it's a good question. You know, that's something, you know, I don't know.
And how do you get these service workers to start talking? Like, are you cold calling them? Like, how do you start to build those relationships?
Yeah, basically just like a very long list of people, cold calling them and saying that we're, you know, transparently saying we're interested in sort of Supreme Court justice travel. We heard it, Clarence Thomas used to be on this boat sometimes, and like with a lot of these things, the kind of percentage hit rate is not very high, but there's a lot of them, so.
And I'm curious for the two of you, like, did you learn from each other's reporting along the way? Like, you're kind of looking into the same person. So I wonder how much, if you were surprised by anything you saw or
I
in
mean,
each other's.
I'll jump in. I was like, they were great stories. I loved the stories, and I really enjoyed the detail that you guys had. And I was actually, fortunately, I was on vacation for the 2 weeks. I was in the Arctic Circle for the 2 weeks that your story ran, and so I did not have to have a front page, like I did not have to have a front seat view of the editors at the New York Times going nuts over it, but they did.
And I want to talk a little bit to you, Joe, about the other reporting you've done more recently. You talked to a pro-life or former pro-life activist, a minister, who talked about just the way he tried to influence the court. Talked about, you know, a time that he was leaked an opinion earlier, and I just wonder how did you find that source?
So he came in over the transom to a certain extent. And the challenge with him was that we did not want this to be, basically, just quickly, he came in with a story that said, it was after Dobbs, and he said he was motivated to come forward to talk to us and to send a letter to Justice Roberts because of the Dobbs leak, the leak of the decision overturning abortion. And the reason being that he had personally been made aware of the outcome of a previous decision, also authored by Justice Alito, and also a huge victory for the religious right, and in a case called Hobby Lobby, which essentially said that corporations did not have, if they could claim a religious liberty exemption and not provide contraception coverage as a result of this decision. And that the reason that he had been able to learn this decision was that he had this whole operation to a $30 million over the course of a number of years operation to infiltrate the court and to insert within the court what he called stealth missionaries, wealthy people who shared his anti-abortion religious beliefs, who used the Supreme Court Historical Society and any other way they could to get close to these justices. Not necessarily to convince them, because they were befriending conservative justices who already sort of were inclined to rule their way, but more almost as a like a astroturfing operation, where they would be surrounded with these people who would convince them that even though, you know, the majority of the American public still support abortion pretty overwhelmingly, it would be okay if they overturned this, you know, 50-year super precedent, which of course I think we've seen in the wake of them overturning this precedent. There's been quite a lot of backlash, but the goal was to convince them that there wouldn't be. And in that pursuit of that goal, they befriended the justices. They had them come to their homes. They arranged for them to join them in beautiful ranches and at the base of the Grand Tetons. They took them to dinners. They did all sorts of things. They prayed with them. So for us, I mean, it was really an amazing story about how a group of people with a very specific agenda were able to kind of get close to these justices. And not just that, I mean, Rob Schenck, also the leader, became very active and befriending them and showing up to their events and so on. And he was able, for instance, to write to Justice Scalia and say, hey, I want you to meet with this guy, Father Pavone, who was a very incendiary anti-abortion activist. And Scalia said, sure, have him arrange it with my secretary. Now, think about that. That's an opportunity for someone to go in there privately with no disclosure whatsoever and basically lobby a justice. And, if that were Congress, someone would have to write it down somewhere, but that was written down nowhere. So I was pretty outraged by all of this. And then the challenge for us was to turn it from a he said to being able to kind of show it. And we were able to do that by pouring through thousands and thousands of pages of emails and documents that suggested very strongly that he, in fact, had gotten this information from one of his stealth missionaries, and that he clearly did know the outcome and the author of the opinion, even though people didn't expect it to be Alito.
Emails that he, yeah, got it,
Yeah.
yeah. And what was the fallout from that story? Can you talk about what happened next?
Well, what's interesting about this is that what people were very surprised by is that the Justice Alito, actually responded in some detail. Typically, and which is sort of surprising, like
Which never happens.
they never talk. They never answer questions. It's kind of like their attitude towards the press is like,
They're above it.
whatever, like we don't speak. And literally the Supreme Court, the Supreme Court press office is like, up until recently, it was just a pretty easy job. Like, no comment, they don't comment. Nope, they're not going to comment. So it was quite surprising that Justice Alito actually came out and put out a whole statement saying that did not deny that he had had dinner with these people on the night before the woman sent Rob Schenck an email saying, had dinner with Justice Alito or had a meal with Justice Alito and have some interesting news, no emails. She said it was that she got sick and he drove her home, but.
It's really wild. And Justin, I want to go to you and the fallout from the first story you published about these trips, which were the trips, had Justice Thomas done anything illegal in that first story?
Well, the sort of ethics law experts that we talked to said yes. I mean, one of the few laws that actually applies to the justices is this post-Watergate disclosure law that applies to many federal officials that requires them to disclose certain gifts, and there's been a shocking amount of ink spilled about that at this point, if you're curious about reading about the ins and outs of it. But after Justice Thomas didn't respond before the story. After the story, after it sort of blew up, he did release a statement that kind of didn't address much of what we reported and acknowledged that there were, I think he used the phrase family trips. And then, we got a number of tips. I mean, we got a tip, the second story we did was that Harlan Crow had bought this real estate that was part owned by Justice Thomas down in Savannah, Georgia, and so Josh and I went down there and got the records, which were just at the Chatham County Courthouse, and that sort of expanded. I mean, and Justice Thomas still hasn't addressed this, but I think it clearly showed this was not a normal friendship where you sometimes travel together. There's this strange situation where Harlan Crow now owns the house that Thomas's mother still lives in and poured a bunch of money into improving it and may or may not be charging her rent.
Because initially the response was, well, we're just friends, right? We go on trips together.
Right. So they both had statements saying they were friends. I mean, just to explain what's on the screen, the painting is something that Harlan Crow commissioned at this resort he owns in the Adirondacks with Thomas and several other people, including Leonard Leo, second from left,
That
I
is
guess.
incredible picture.
The
It really
kind
speaks
of
so
strange thing about, so I actually talked to the painter of this, which helped, and one thing, and I was like, originally we were like, oh, is this a photo? And he was like, oh no, Harlan brought me in and I took a bunch of photos and then painted it, and it's actually, it looks like a photo, but actually the statue of the Native American in real life is 2 to 3 times bigger. And he said it looked so large I had to shrink it, or else the whole proportions looked at it. We're still not quite sure why that's there or what it's supposed to mean. But I think, this was an interesting piece of evidence on something that's still sort of an open question, which is like, what is the nature of this friendship, which I think is a real friendship, and there really are family trips. But when you look at this, I mean, like everyone in this picture is involved. Like the only thing that I know of that connects the 5 people in this picture is being like very involved in the kind of conservative legal movement. And obviously Supreme Court justices are allowed to have friends, but when there's money enters the picture and you're being hosted at great expense by your friend, then it starts to raise much more interesting questions, I think.
And can you talk a little bit about the reporting behind the story about, how Harlan Crow now owns the home that Clarence Thomas's mother lives in? How did you go about reporting that? You got a tip. What did you do next?
Yeah, after the first story was published, we got a tip from somebody who had heard this, and so I think 2 days after the first story was published, Josh and I flew down to Savannah, where Justice Thomas grew up, where his mom still lives. He has a bunch of family there. This was a situation where these actually were public records. They weren't on the internet, but they were pretty easy to get. We got them the following Monday morning, and then we knocked on some doors and
Isn't it
wrote the
so
story.
funny how, over the course of your career, how many moments of sheer joy are spent in some dingy microfiche film, right?
Right.
Filmed room.
I've heard Savannah is lovely. I didn't see any of the lovely parts of it.
We at More Perfect are doing a story about Clarence Thomas's past and how he grew up in Georgia, and just kind of trying to get inside his head. So plug for that. And when you knocked on the door, what were you asking folks?
Well, one question was whether, so Justice Thomas's mother is quite elderly, and we knew that she had lived in this house that Harlan Crow bought. And by the way, he bought this house, but where he says he's going to put a museum someday about Justice Thomas, but the part that has never really been addressed directly is that he also bought 2 vacant lots from them, down the street, and kind of spruced up the neighborhood. So one question was is Harlan Crow Clarence Thomas's mother's landlord? Is she still living there? And so we were asking people what they'd heard about because he sort of bought up half the block. So we were asking people what they'd heard about, whether she still lived there, and yeah.
And just taking a step back from the reporting for a second, I guess for me reading your stories, my experience was, wait a second, is this kind of undue influence happening with more justices? Has this been happening longer? Have we as journalists been doing a good enough job covering this institution over the years? And Joe, I wonder, what do you think, having watched it for a while?
I'll answer quickly, but we're getting the sign to go to
Yep.
questions. I think that clearly, there's been a long and really storied history of great Supreme Court reporters who cover the day in and day out, which is an enormously difficult and taxing job of covering the opinions on super complicated issues and the oral arguments. And so I want to just sort of start there. But clearly, as the investigative reporters out there, I think, look, this is a ripe target. And I think to some extent, we gave them a pass, maybe because of what you were talking about, this vision of the court as the bestower of justice and equality. But also, I do think that we have reached this inflection point where ProPublica and the New York Times and you and many others are focused on this because the Supreme Court, for a pretty long time, had there was a consensus that they would operate in certain ways because they were cognizant that their power doesn't come from the sword. It doesn't have a military to enforce its rulings. It doesn't come from the purse. It doesn't have money that it can hold or withhold, but it only had the belief in its own legitimacy by the American public. And what has changed, I think, in recent years is that this consensus of how to keep that legitimacy has shifted. And you have justices like Justice Thomas, and I think to some extent, great extent, Justice Alito, who simply say that the norms by which the court has done that, for instance, giving great deference to opinions of the past, something called stare decisis, that they don't just sort of willy-nilly upend precedents because otherwise they just look like a legislative body that, is like every time there's a new justice, the law changes. Justice Thomas has been pretty clear. He doesn't believe in that. And some of these other norms, I think, are where you don't sort of go on, become openly political. You don't have a spouse and you sort of pursuing this common agenda, one from the bench and one from the grassroots trenches. That's all starting to change, and I think the scrutiny is changing because of that.
Yeah. All right, I guess we will go to questions there in the back. Why don't we go right? Oh, either way, that's great.
Hi, I'm Mattathias Schwartz from Insider. My hat's off to both of you. The conduct here is so outrageous, so thank you both for shedding light to it. My question is, it seems from where I sit that Senator Durbin from the Senate Judiciary Committee and Chief Justice John Roberts, who's the only person or one of the people who could rein this in, are on a kind of collision course, and that Durbin is demanding some kind of change, and Roberts is saying, we don't answer to anyone. I'm hoping both of you could lay out some scenarios, if you agree with that premise, for how this might end if neither one of them backs down.
So I would say, yeah, I think you are correct. I think that, obviously, for those of you that don't know, in the wake of some of Justin's reporting and all of these cascade of revelations, you have the democratically controlled Senate Judiciary Committee starting to ask real questions, and they asked John Roberts to come in or designate another justice to come in to kind of answer to some of this, and they are asking that the justices enact a code of conduct that is, in fact, actually binding on them. And basically, the answer that they got last week, this week or last week, in a letter from John Roberts was, we don't need no stinking badges and we're not going to answer your questions. And to be fair, like there is a debatable constitutional principle as to whether Congress could enact a binding code of conduct on the justices. They were insulated from this kind of thing for a reason, because you don't want a Congress who's not happy with how they rule to start, passing all these laws to crib their power. But that's where we're at, and I don't really see the justices doing anything. Do you?
No. I guess it's interesting that Justice Alito and Justice Thomas came out with statements, at least. I can't stress enough how rare that is. So I don't know, but I don't know. Justin, how about you?
I don't want to speculate. There's a hearing on Tuesday. There's a Senate Judiciary hearing about the broad issues on this Tuesday.
Question over here.
Hi, I'm Mark Schufs, and in a different life, I worked for the Wall Street Journal, and in the news pages, I want to stress. But the Wall Street Journal editorial page has been on this crusade against the reporting that ProPublica has done. So I just want to give Justin a chance to respond. And the two main issues, as I can tell, is one, there is no story here. He had a friendship. He went on vacation. Nothing to see here. And second of all, one that I literally couldn't make sense of, I read it twice by one of their columnists about the property was somehow wrong in Georgia or in a different county. Literally I read it twice, I couldn't understand what on earth it was saying. But would you like to take the opportunity to respond to those criticisms that have been launched against you and your colleagues.
Well, I sort of fear the Streisand effect here. I asked somebody if they'd heard about these stories, and they said, "Oh, it's behind a paywall, so we can't read them." But the op-eds. But no, I mean, I think there's been one writer at the Wall Street Journal editorial page, James Toronto, who's written a column like every day, sort of attacking us, which originally went from accusing us of being incurious to now he now says he's documented multiple errors. But I think the main thing is just that there absolutely have not been any actual factual errors brought to our attention, and we've posted all the primary documents. And the ethics disclosure law at issue here is not actually that complicated. You can look it up and read it. And, many of these trips were clearly had to be disclosed. And there's a CNN story last week that, based on an anonymous source, and so this is not official yet, but saying that Justice Thomas is going to amend his disclosure on the real estate transaction, which also legally had to be disclosed. I don't know if he's actually going to do that because Supreme Court hasn't answered questions about it. But if that's true, I feel like that vindicates that story. Thank you. But thanks for the opportunity, Mark.
Can I just sneak in one question here? So, Clarence.
I have the deep fake you do it.
I know, this is the real thing. So just one quick question to Justin. If I remember Clarence Thomas saying that he loves his idea of a great vacation is taking his RV and going to like a Walmart parking lot and hanging out with regular folks. And so I know that like the Thomases and the Crows are like great family friends and they go on vacations together. And I just wanted to know whether or not there's any sign of the Crows and the Thomases together in the RV in a Walmart parking lot.
We have not seen that. That quote was found by my colleague Alex, the researcher on these stories. And the kind of funny thing about that was it's actually from a documentary that was made, a kind of very hagiographic documentary made about Clarence Thomas's life that was funded by Harlan Crow, among other people. But no, it actually, just briefly, one of the interesting things about Justice Thomas's career is, he very rarely gives interviews to the mainstream media. But one of the only, I believe, maybe the only TV interview he ever gave was to 60 Minutes about 10 or 15 years ago, and the entire sort of conceit of it was that the 60 Minutes correspondent was with him in the RV, driving around the country. And so I find it interesting, there clearly has been like a kind of deliberate attempt at branding him, but by him and his sort of close allies, that, clearly diverges from at least how he sometimes travels.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Joe and Justin and Julia.